Hey, what's up, everybody? Chris Fluke here. Chris Fluke Podcast, episode number 116. In this episode, we're going to kind of recap my week, man. We had a girl camp here, which was incredible. We had the interview with Coach Shirk, and then lastly, we had unexpected emergency room visit with my young daughter in the middle of the night, kind of like they always are, right? You know, the emergency room visits are never on your own time, right? They're always on whatever time the event happens, and you got to get out, get up, get in that car and get yourself to the hospital. Now, the recap with Coach Shirk. Now, just to give you a quick background, man, this was a guy, I first got into coaching with junior high wrestling, which is grades 7 and 9. I had this plan, this scheme, this idea to start coaching football at a high school level. So my brother's coaching wrestling. I started assisting there. From there, I'm there for a year or two, and then I asked about coaching football, right? So I started coaching middle school football, which is grades 7 and 8. Then eventually I talked to somebody, an old coach of mine. I'm like, hey, I want to coach high school. What do you think I should do? He's like, just tell the high school coach. Let the high school coach know that you're interested, man. Let him know that I'm interested. I get on the high school staff, right? And I do that for over a decade. It wouldn't have happened if I didn't start with Coach Shirk's program there with wrestling, right? So I'm coaching there for a while. Learned a lot of great lessons. I learned a lot of, the good, the bad, the ugly, and I also learned about how to build a winning program, right? Because there's not that many state champ winning coaches. I've met hundreds of coaches, right? But not many of those individuals have won state championships. And not only, it wasn't one of these things where like, you got lucky with the group of kids that are there. That happens a lot, right? This guy built a program from scratch. We were not good when he first started. But over time, he was able to develop and build this program. Some of the key things that I learned from this, right, is one, you just got to keep doing what you feel is right. Keep trying to build. Keep trying to move yourself in the right direction. Fortunately for Coach Shirk there, he's never really satisfied, and that's kind of the curse of being a coach. You always want to do a little bit better and do a little bit more, right? When I've worked with other coaches where we'd have a successful season or two, it was oftentimes just dependent upon the kids that we had on the team. But in order to build a consistent program, there's a few certain qualities that you need to have. You look at, the great NFL coaches, the great college coaches, the great wrestling coaches, right? You got Cale Sanderson at Penn State. He's going to be a winner no matter what's going on. Nick Saban at Alabama. He's going to be a winner. He's got a system put into place. He knows how to coach, and he knows how to let his coaches coach, right? So these guys are not scared to delegate. Coach Shirk, things started to really click for the program when he was able to put together that ideal coaching staff. You mentioned the Roan guys. He mentioned having some good junior high guys in there, right? It all started to click. This guy has his strengths here. I have my strengths here. He has their strengths there, and so on, right? You kind of get the best of everybody, not just of your athletes, right? But you want to get the best out of all of the coaches as well. And not having that ego that's going to prevent, somebody from doing a great job. If somebody's giving out pointers on a certain technique, right? And you have to come in there and just give your say because you're the head coach, or get the last word, this and that, right? That stuff's not going to work. Eventually, that person is not going to speak up because he just knows he's going to get overshadowed by the coach. Or if that coach always tries to steal the thunder, right? Tries to take credit for certain things that maybe he shouldn't have got credit for. That's gonna have assistant coaches want to leave. So having the power to delegate and then letting them do their job is crucial. Being that head coach, you think about an umbrella. That head coach is at the top, and then all those other coaches kind of branch off from there, right? That's what being a head coach is, man. Putting trust and putting faith in your staff to do their jobs, and in the end, you'll be successful for it. Next lesson, man. Nip it in the bud. This is an important one, and I use that conversation that you might have with a loved one, right? Where if you have a small problem, a super tiny problem, but if you don't address it when it happens, it's going to continue to grow until it becomes a huge problem, right? Coach Shirk said, anytime a problem arises, nip it in the bud, man. Get rid of it ASAP. Address it, move past it, get going in the right direction. A tremendous lesson. Whether or not you're a coach or just in your personal life in general. When a problem arises, address it in that moment. Don't put it off for another day, because the longer you put that off, the bigger it's going to grow. Surround yourself with good people. This is in addition to those coaches. You got to surround yourself with people in the community, right? You're kind of a, don't know what that line is, that quote is, but it's like you're a collection of the 5 people that you spend the most time with, right? So take a look around about the people that you're spending your time with. Are they doing good for you or are they not doing good for you? If they're not doing good for you, you're going to have to cut the slack, right? You got to coach to the kid. This goes back to the early education stuff. Everything is developmentally appropriate. DAP, right? Developmentally appropriate practices or principles. That's what it needs. That's the best way to educate a child in the classroom, and that's the best way to coach a kid in the room, on the football field, on the soccer pitch, wherever it may be, right? You have to coach to everybody's level and try to raise them up a notch, right? You got to nudge them into that next zone, whatever that next zone may be. You got to get them to be a little bit better version of who they are today, right? And the only way you're going to do that is if you get on that kid's level, you talk to them, you know where they're coming from, and you slowly but surely build trust, and then through that trust, you're going to be able to get them to a good spot. And then lastly, this guy worried me a little bit. Coach Shirk, if you're listening to this, using fear as a motivation, man, I don't know where this stems from, but man, eventually I think this is kind of like that whole thing about never being satisfied, right? The motivation is kind of like a negative thing, and it's a little bit worrisome. I said, I'm not going to touch on that one in the moment when we were talking in our conversation. But I think in the long haul, finding something to motivate you outside of just that fear component, fear of being viewed as a loser, fear of being wrong, fear of the repercussions from somebody, hounding you for this or that or the other thing, you can think about the kid that gets disciplined all the time, right? His motivation is not that he wants to do the task well. His motivation is the fear of being disciplined, right? And you would rather have the kid, use a different kind of tool to motivate as opposed to the fear of, being viewed as something that you don't want to be viewed as. So Coach Shirk, I hope that wasn't offensive by any means. It was just kind of my thoughts on something that came up in the conversation, right? Moving on. Doctors. Another trip to the emergency room. Daughter, fever. Just wakes up randomly. Is cooking, man. She's hot. Her body she's like a little heater. We're in bed with her. She's super hot. She's chatty. It's like she's delirious. She's talking like she's sleep talking, but she's awake. It's really weird and it's odd. We don't know what's going on. Then all of a sudden we hear her breathing, and it's just like her breath rate was 30, 40 breaths higher than what it normally is. Let's say it's usually 20. It was 48 when we're at the hospital, right? Well over twice the amount. And then lastly, her heart rate was sky high. Marisa woke up at one point. The first time she woke up, was like, we're going to the hospital. And I was like, okay, what's going on? And then she called the doctor. The doctor was like, see if there's anything we can do to bring the fever down. Things just kind of got worse. So we ended up going to the emergency room. And we talk. We had a great doctor there. And he was totally on board with bringing her in there. He's like, we're here. Come on in. We'll support you in any way possible. And that's exactly what they did. They gave her some Tylenol. They did some other things. We got her fever under control. She basically was just hanging out in her underwear because her body was so hot. So we did some things to cool her down, right? And we just hung out for a little bit until everything else kind of calmed down, her breathing and all that stuff. So once all that stuff calmed down, we were able to go home. Now this thing was weird. This fever had her up for like 4 hours. So from like 12 to 4, she was up. Then as we're getting ready to go to the hospital, leave the hospital, then she gets tired and she falls asleep. So her body was just like up, just fighting whatever was going on. And it wouldn't let her rest and relax. And as we're there, we're talking to this doctor. This doctor was a great man in the sense that he was willing to understand that maybe the way they're doing things is wrong. I always think about that. I remember this quote. What if the way that we always have been doing things is wrong? You think about some of these great moments in history. A guy like Charles Darwin, for example, when he came up with his theory of evolution. If he didn't just look at these things and like, wait a second, something's not right here. Something doesn't make sense to me. I think our belief is wrong here. Let me explore this thing. If he didn't do that, where would we be with that kind of thought? There's all kinds of examples with this, having that ability. We talked about Coach Shirk and that lack of humility, right? Just having the ability to look at things and say, wait a second here. Maybe what we are doing is wrong. Maybe we need to reevaluate what's going on. So what did this doctor do? This doctor, I think his last name was Harvey, pediatric emergency room. He said he went back and he started looking at some different approaches, right? He said in the past he wouldn't always give advice like, because he knew that, you tell a patient 10 things, they have to do 10 things when they leave. He's like, you're lucky if they're able to do one, right? So he just got frustrated with that whole thing. And he's like, I stopped talking about diet with everybody. I stopped telling people to stop smoking. I stopped doing some stuff like this. And then I started thinking about this, like, getting yourself healthier. These medical treatments that we're giving out at this hospital is all fine and dandy. But at the end of the day, you might not be here for medical treatments if we created a better, healthier version of who you are, right? So he started taking that approach. And there's this Dr. Angel Weil who's got some great stuff in terms of just getting yourself back on track, spirit, like mentally, spiritually, things of that nature, which people start to poo-poo right away. But let me tell you something, it was nice to meet somebody that just kind of had the ability to think outside the box. So he went and he did a bunch of trainings on trying to heal people on their own so that he could talk to people and kind of meet them where they are, going back to that coaching thing, right? Meet people where they are and try to nudge them in the right direction. Try to nudge them in that next zone. There's this thing called the zone of proximal development where people are where they are, right? And you want them to move forward and advance forward. And how do you do that? By introducing that next zone, that next step forward. And then once they get that next step, then you can add the next step. You don't just throw everything at them at once. You got to get them into the next zone, that zone of proximal development. You have a kid that's trying to learn how to write their name. You start with something, right? You start with something and then you just try to say, hey, next time, why don't you try to do it this way? Then next thing you know, why don't we do more than just your name? Like you get them to write their name, and then why don't we do your full name? Then why don't we do your first and last name? Then why don't we start working out all these different words? And then next thing you're teaching how to draw. You got these fine motor skills going on there, and they pick up how to write the alphabet basically. You could do that with just about everything, right? You just try to nudge people in the next zone a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And he found himself not doing that with people. So what did he do? He tried to become more well-versed in communicating with people and try to get them moving in the right direction, not just always looking for medical interventions, trying to seek out how to improve themselves on their own. That I give this man credit, right? And plus he spent so much time talking to us about this stuff. It came down to this: if I don't tell him, who's gonna tell him? It's kind of my job, right? I feel that way too, man. I got some people coming into the gym and they want to be up late. They want to go out drinking and all this other stuff. And I'm like, well, you know what? They're kind of paying to come here. They might be paying for some advice that they don't want to hear. And if they don't hear it from me, then who's going to tell them? So shout out to him. And in the conclusion of this conversation, we started talking about things. We started talking about what was going on at the hospital with lockdowns. And when the lockdowns were going on, right? And I was telling him, I was like, man, in my work here, I do a lot of reading on childhood obesity. And over the course of these lockdowns, the obesity rate, not overweight, just literally the obesity rate, went from 19 to 22%. That increase was like what they saw in the last 10 to 20 years. This happened in a little bit over 2 years. So they had a 3% increase in just overweight. Now, there's also about 20-ish% kids that are overweight. So now we're in that 40 and above range, right? And my stats could be wrong there. I don't have the overweight stats off the top of my head, but I know that it was very comparable to the obesity rate. And as I brought that up to him, he's like, you know what? He's like, that's a solid point. He's like, but right now, some of that stuff is a little bit down the road. I didn't necessarily agree with that. I think there's people in my line of work, in my field that works with kids, that we need to kind of grab that and address it now. And he said, when I look in addition to that, I think it was a CDC article. No, it's coming from the Aspen Institute. They talked to a lot of doctors, and at the end of it, they had all these crazy health things. Then he said at the end of it, there's also going to be these mental health ramifications that we haven't been able to unpack yet. And as I said that, he said, you know what? He's like, as I got into this job, I never would have thought that I'd be seeing what I see. He's like, we have an emergency room filled with suicidal teenagers. He's like, these kids come in and we talk to them and we're like, this is a normal kid. He's like, and then we get in these conversations and we're like, all right, well, red flag, red flag, red flag, red flag. He's like, we're going to have to keep you here. We're going to have to do some more. We're going to have to talk about this stuff, right? And that was one thing that kind of broke my heart a little bit because, I worked with teenagers, man, and I'm sure there's kids that come in here that are suffering and going through all of these things, these suicidal thoughts and all that, and I'm probably missing it, all right? So as a coach, as a person that deals with the youth in the community, and actually as anybody, most people deal with kids in some form or another. These are some scary things that I think we all need to keep in mind and consider. When you're about to reprimand somebody, about to give them a bunch of crap, discipline them for this or that or the other thing, we got to remember we might have to meet these kids with where they are might not be in a good place, but we still got to be there for them. We got to support them. We can't give up on anybody. You know, if not you, then who? Hope you guys liked this episode. Peace, everybody.